Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to yet another Horus Heresy lore roundup video. We are now on book 4 of the Horus Heresy series. This book runs parallel to the 3 previous books and introduces us to a new figure that we just briefly met in the 3rd. Nathaniel Garro, battle captain of the Death Guard's 7th Great Company. And on that note, let's immediately begin the lore roundup by explaining what a Great Company is, because these are not the equivalents of the companies within, for example, the Lunar Wolves. The Death Guards had 7 Great Companies, which were of course considerably less than, for example, the Lunar Wolves, who had 20 just in the 63rd expedition. However, these companies were considerably larger and were divided into sub-companies. In fact, the Death Guards were one of the largest legions out of them all. But they were to be gathered in 7 companies, because 7 was a good number, according to Mortarion at least. This of course meant that a great deal of power was concentrated in fairly few individuals, there only being 7 captains, of which Nathaniel Garro was one. This led to some interesting consequences. I'll get more into this in my proper video on the Death Guard, but the Death Guard were very, very different from a lot of legions, and I'd go so far as to say that while in most cases the return of their primarchs were a happy event and an improvement to the legion, in the case of the Death Guard, I would say that Mortarion was downright a detriment to the legion as a whole. He introduced a host of, less than wonderful changes, shall we say. For now, all you really need to know is that the Death Guard despised weakness, and even the slightest hint of it. This led to a rather fierce form of competition within the Legion, which we can see almost immediately in the book, where we can tell that the captains were not on particularly good terms. In fact, there were clear lines drawn between the various factions. Nathaniel Garro, for example, had what could, at best, be described as a fierce rivalry with another captain by the name of Yorgal, and, perhaps more accurately, be considered outright animosity between the two. In part, this is probably already due to Mortarion's machinations, because we can see Typhus, the captain of the First Company, actively encouraging this sort of behavior when he talks to Yorgal, the captain of the Second Company. It's clear right from the get-go that while many legions did eventually start splintering and becoming more disunited as the Horusy progressed, the Death Guard were already well on their way. In fact, they were probably at what I'd call the midpoint of their moral and spiritual degeneration. And we can see this in several more examples as well. For example, in Mortarion's elite bodyguards, the so-called Death Shroud. These are members of the Death Guards that are listed as killed in action, but instead secretly recruited into the Death Shroud as an undead guard of sorts to Mortarion. They may never be more than 49 paces away from him, which of course is 7 times 7. For those of you who are unacquainted with these esoterical things, the number 7 is somewhat special. It's always been connected a bit to the mythical, the magical, and the esoterical, and in 40k, it contains a fair bit of power within, well, suggestion. It is a magical number, quote-unquote, whereas, of course, there is no magic, quote-unquote. In 40k, there is of course the warp, and in the warp, the things we think have power do have power. Therefore, the number 7 does have power. And considering the fact that Mortarion has gotten rather close to warp influence already, it would not be a stretch to suggest that Mortarion was probably already corrupted. Now, that is a somewhat strong accusation, and I do not believe that he began this way, but considering how he was raised, which I'll get to in his video again, he probably was a little bit kooky in the head. Not to mention, he always had a certain resentment towards the Emperor. He viewed the Emperor as, how should I put this, the antithesis of his ideology. Mortarion was of the opinion that man should always seek out the strength to do for himself whatever was necessary. He did not really consider the idea of help to be at all that valuable. In fact, he considered it to be, at least in part, outright detrimental. If a man could not do for himself what needed to be done, then he did not deserve to have that thing achieved. So on and so on. Now, to begin with, this was not so much a hard rule as a necessity. The planet upon which Mortarion was found was uncomfortable, to put it fucking mildly. It was not a place where the weak had any chance whatsoever of surviving, and so a nice, powerful creed that only the strong may survive was necessary for anyone to survive. But with the Death God, he took that to the absolute extreme. It went to the point that it was no longer merely about the strong surviving, it was about the strong dominating all others, and the weak being less than chaff. In fact, it was worse than that. Not only were you, being weak, pointless, you were an active detriment to everything else, and therefore, you had to be rooted out. And the reason why he took on this extreme stance was because he was found to be weak, and the Emperor was found to not be. And that's enough of a tease for now. You're gonna have to wait for the full Mortarion video if you would like to know more. And speaking of Mortarion, there is also a vague possibility, at the very least, that he is also a Psyker. Now, there is a suggestion that all of the Primarchs are at some basic latent level Psykers, but Mortarion displays feats of stealth that even Corax would find impressive, and Corax's stealth is mostly due to the fact that he is a Psyker, so if Mortarion is capable of feats similar, then it would stand to reason that he probably has some of the same skills. Granted, Mortarion doesn't seem to be quite as good, but he's still very, very good. It might be within the realms of good old-fashioned physical possibilities, but I doubt it. He managed to stay unobserved in a briefing room, granted a badly lit briefing room, with several legionaries inside it, and nobody noticed him. Asati's legionaries are not known for being particularly dull, so the fact that nobody noticed suggests he's pretty goddamn good. Probably unnaturally good. As for why he was in the briefing room, though, is quite interesting. We get another example of a Xenos species here, which is one of the reasons I like the Horus Heresy, because occasionally they meet something new and interesting and they describe them, like the murder arachnids, for example. Those were amusing. This species are called the Yorgal. They are a fascinating little species because they appear to be interstellar nomads. They don't seem to settle actively, instead they live upon giant bottle worlds, huge spacefaring cylinders inside of which they have created a simulated version of what I assume to be their home world, which is lost in all due likelihood. I have a hard time imagining that a species would choose to travel through space like this unless they didn't have a whole lot of a choice. See, the Eldar, for example. Now, naturally, this comes with certain limitations and problems. If your society is going to be traveling through space in a bottle world like this, you've got a fair few problems, like, for example, resources. How are you going to find more resources? Well, first and foremost, a high technological level of recycling is going to be necessary, because every single ounce of resources is going to be immeasurably more valuable since you can't mine any more. Secondly, they're probably going to have some way of getting said resources. Now, this is probably one of the reasons why the Imperials want them out of their space. They're probably raiding all kinds of trade routes and local planets for extra resources. And thirdly, no matter how good you are at these two things, life in this fashion is going to be difficult, to put it fucking bluntly, and every member of society is almost certainly going to have to be highly specialized to conduct their task in the most effective manner possible, because again, resources are going to be exceedingly scarce. You can't allow anybody to waste anything in this kind of environment, and that is probably why they are such a highly specialized species. The Imperium has yet to find a single natural Yorgal. Every single example of the Xeno species has some form of modification, some form of enhancement, presumably to allow them to perform their tasks better. For example, their ground-bound warrior class have had their eyes removed and replaced with high-quality optics, and they have even had weapons nestled into their very arms. Additionally, their natural legs appear to have been amputated and been replaced with rollers of a sort. And these augmentations appear to be universal, again suggesting that they were specifically designed for a certain purpose. And we also get an example of airborne warriors who have had a lot of their skeletal structure removed and or reduced, allowing them to fly easier, as well of course as the implementation of wings. Unfortunately for the Yorgal, however, their modifications were not quite enough to stand up to the Legiones Astartes. This was one of their remaining fleets in this part of Imperial space, and the Death Guard had been sent to deal with them specifically due to their talents. The Death Guards are highly resistant to all forms of damage, including toxins, and the Yorgal breed a rather fascinating mix of oxygen, nitrogen, and chloride, a poison that would be unfortunate for most humans, if not downright lethal, but to the Space Marines it would offer minor inconveniences at absolute worst. Additionally, it had to be assumed that since the Yorgals would be playing on their home field in the most literal term possible, they'd probably have a fair few defenses set up around their bottle worlds, and so a nice tough legion like the Death Guard would seem like the obvious choice. Now, the Yorgal bottle world was protected by a fairly considerable screening fleet, but the Death Guard also had a massive fleet of their very own. And so, while the Death Guard fleet would deal with the Yorgal screen using lances, bombardment guns, and boarding torpedoes, the main strike force would head straight towards the bottle world, in Cestus assault ramps, Thunderhawks, assault ships, and of course, yet more boarding torpedoes. Presumably, this would be the best way to deal with anything like a Yorgal world ship like this. Its sheer size would mean that bombarding it into ruins would, take a while. A long fucking while. And Mortarion is not the patient type, whilst pouring it full of Death Guard legionaries, on the other hand, would allow them to clean it out the good old-fashioned way. And of course, once the boarders found their way to the bridge and the reactors, etc., they could put a very large hole in the ship with relatively little effort. Elements of Nathaniel Garro's company was also involved in the assault upon the bottle world, including Garro himself. His personal objective was the destruction of the Yorgal hatchery clusters. This, unsurprisingly, is where they hatched new Yorgal, and it was also the place where they modified the Yorgal. Apparently, they had invented some form of advanced biomechanical chemistry nonsense, whatever the fuck, that allowed them to not only grow new Yorgal in this hatchery, but also allowed them to modify them. It sounds as if a Yorgal was born naturally from one of these pods, presumably, and then placed within another pod to receive their modifications, which is why Garro was warned that he might run into fully armed and developed adults as well as the children, quote-unquote, inside of the hatchery. This is all kind of fascinating to me, so this clearly suggests a hive mind within the Yorgal, because presumably the Yorgal young have very little, if any whatsoever, choice of what they actually want to be when they, quote-unquote, grow up. In all due likelihood, they are taken as newborn babes, and then immediately undergo the modification process to turn them into whatever society has decided they are going to be. Now again, this suggests a hive mind, because if this was an individualistic race, I imagine a lot of people would have problems with this quite obvious shoehorning. It would also go a fairly long way to explain how they are even capable of living in such an isolated and finite resources environment. If it's a hive mind, then the individual doesn't matter in the slightest. Resources can be divided according to who needs it the most at any given time, regardless of who might not receive the said resources. For example, during times of war, far more resources might be spent creating and feeding warriors, while less important parts parts of the collective could simply be left to starve. And in periods of relative tranquility, the warriors might be left to starve, and the more peaceful occupations like farmers, craftsmen, and builders might be given extra resources to conduct, for example, repairs after a lengthy battle, or to produce the various stuff they need to carry out the augmentations, and so on and so on. This is a society that regulates itself without any need for particularly long-term planning. Let's, for example, say that they ran into a particularly hostile sector. They had to do a lot of fighting, and therefore produce a lot of warriors, but then they exit that area, and suddenly the warriors are no longer necessary. Now, within human society, that would be a rather large problem, because what are you going to do then? You've already genetically modified, and externally modified as well, these people to be warriors. Do you put them through the exact same process in reverse? I guess that could be possible, and the Yorgal might do just that, but a hive mind would have the perfect solution to that problem. They would simply kill off the workers, and the workers would have absolutely no mind to resist because, again, hive mind. Then they would recycle them and make something more useful out of it. This is a very helpful trait if you're going to be living in a society where resources are as scarce and as finite as would be the case on a bottle world. And when Nathaniel Garro and his men enter the hatchery, we receive yet more evidence that this seems quite likely. They of course start burning the trees and murdering whatever they can find, but in the midst of doing this, they run into a very, very powerful psyker that was newly birthed. And the simple fact that he was born that way suggests, quite obviously, that there was a reason behind it. He was probably part of the command structure, or, well, intended to become part of the command structure of the hive mind, and he was a pretty goddamn powerful psyker as well. Not only was he capable of driving several battle brothers to their knees with a mental assault, but apparently it also managed to see into the future, as it told Garro that he would see everything he loved fall apart, collapse in and upon itself, and that he would be betrayed by those closest to him. Now, personally, I actually don't think that he saw the future, because seeing that future is exceedingly difficult. Even the most skilled and talented of the Eldar Farseers were not able to see this shit coming. They saw some big and bad shit on the way, but they couldn't make out the details, and yet this thing could? I find that unlikely. Possible, but unlikely. Now, what it could have done, however, was reach into Garro's mind and find his greatest fear. And being betrayed by his brother Legionnaires, that would quite probably be it. It was a mental attack, rather than a reading of the future. Or it might just have been shoddy writing, that's also possible. The writer going like, well, this'll be a dramatic reveal and make the reader go like, gasp, it's all true. And, well, yes, that is probably the most likely scenario, but my way sounds cooler, so that's the one I'm gonna go with personally. In the end, the Psyker was defeated not through the brute strength of the Astartes, or, well, partially due to the brute strength of a bolt around, but with a great deal of help from the Silent Sisterhood, who had detached a formation to help the Death Guard against the Yorgal, as they clearly already knew they were at least, in part, a psychic species. And we should probably dive into the Silent Sisterhoods just a little bit as well. This is a formation created by the Emperor out of untouchables, psychic voids. These people are blank spots in the warp, although I would argue that they are not so much blank spots as they are the absolute opposite of the warp. They, in fact, destroy the influence of the warp wherever they go. So rather than simply just not appearing, they are actively terminating the warp in a small area around them. The size of this sphere of influence varies greatly from sister to sister. It can be quite large, or it can be just a personal force field of sorts. The Silent Sisterhood is, of course, entirely made up of, well, sisters. There are no male Silent Sisters. Exceedingly sexist, I know, but oh well, what can you do? Instead, most of the male blanks that are brought in are turned into Colexus assassins. There are a few other purposes for them as well, but we shan't digress too far. The Sisters of Silence were of course also an elite fighting formation, which is why they could keep up with the Death Guard at all and not simply just be a massive fucking hindrance. And it was this shared bond of martial prowess that saw one of their commanders develop a bit of a bond with Nathaniel Garro. Oh, another mention of the Silent Sisters: they can't speak, thereby the name Silent Sisters. Their initiates can still talk, and they are used as translators between the Silent Sisters and the outside world. Between them, they communicate using a very complex form of sign language, in fact, several fairly complex forms of sign language. Anyways, returning to the battlefield, after the death of the Psyker and the very, very, very large biomechanical organism that was guarding it, the rest of the hatchery was cleaned out by the Death Guard and put to the torch. And while Nathaniel was busy burning large quantities of babies, Mortarion and the rest of the Death Guard were sweeping the bottle world clean. And shortly thereafter, the massive construct was deemed to have been suitably pacified, after which its guidance controls were sabotaged and set on a course that would lead it directly into the nearest star, which should certainly take care of the ship quite nicely. The Mechanicum had requested the privilege to pillage any and all interesting technology from the bottle world, and Mortarion gave them a brief window to do so, but, well, Mortarion is not the most patient of fellows, so brief window indeed, unless the local adepts wish to take a close look at the superheated ball of plasma at the center of this particular star system. All in all, the pacification of the Yorgal wasn't much of a challenge for the Death Guard. They had gone in and out with relatively minimal casualties, having essentially annihilated an entire goddamn civilization in a fucking evening. Welcome to 30k, everyone. So, now two interesting things happen more or less at once. We get a lot of insight into the various rituals of the Death Guard, so in no particular order I'm going to go over the next events. First and foremost, the Death Guard are a highly ritualistic and traditional legion. This is due to the fact that Mortarion despises weakness, but he does value tradition, because if you make the traditions hard enough, they are naturally the antithesis to weakness. For example, if every single Legionary has to undergo 7 days of ridiculously hard trials before they can actually become a Legionary, that would certainly weed out the weak. One that is mentioned is the Thorn Garden, which is essentially a very large area entirely covered in poisonous thorns that the would-be aspirants have to cross, without any kind of protection, obviously. Just imagine that for a moment. For something along the lines of a full day, you're going to be walking through massive amounts of thorn bushes. Completely naked. Venomous thorn bushes. Not anybody's idea of a vacation, I would think. And every single Death Guard Legionary would have to go through this trial and more. Naturlichen, most of the aspirants who undergo the trials and fail simply just die. Those who do not have essentially 3 options. 1, they may return to their clan in shame, and considering how their society view weaklings, that's not a particularly tempting option. 2, they may put a bolt round through their own heads. Most select this option because, well, it's better than number 1. Or 3, they may be inducted into the Legion in a different way. Now, some Legions make use of their failed aspirants as various forms of service personnel. In the case of the Death Guard, they don't normally do this, but if an existing Legionary chooses to do so, he may take a failed aspirant as his housecarl. This is a tradition dating all the way back to the time when the Death Guard were the Dusk Raiders, and they originated from Terra. Most of the new Death Guards, originating from Barbarous, don't think much of this tradition. They see it as rewarding weakness, and being Mortarion's boys, that shit just doesn't fly. Nathaniel Garro, however, is a Terran, one of the original Dusk Guard, and he used this right to save an aspirant by the name of Caleb, and it's damn lucky that he did, but we'll get to that much, much later. This shows another reason why the Death Guard appears to be so divided compared to the other legions. They have divided themselves amongst national lines? Oh, no, not really. I wouldn't really say that would be correct. Cultural lines would perhaps be more accurate, with the Terrans on one side and the Barbarous-born on the other. And a lot of this comes down to Mortarion. His entrance into his legion was traumatic. Very traumatic. And a lot of the older legionaries, although still obviously loyal to their primarchs, in fact practically biologically programmed to be so, were not all that fond of a lot of the new traditions. But of course they were introduced by their primarchs, so pretty much all of the old legionaries at the very least attempted to change and accept these new traditions, but they also vehemently held on to their old ways. And while none of it would ever say so openly, many thought that Mortarion's arrival had been detrimental to the Legion as a whole. This, unsurprisingly, led to a fair bit of conflict. Nothing overly violent, no internal schisms of a major sort, just a lot of hostility and extreme rivalry. Not the friendly jostling that we saw in the early days of the Mournival, but outright hostile competition, where one would consider the success of the other to always be at the direct expense of their own position within the Legion. And as luck would have it, an excellent example of this was coming right up. After every major engagement, Mortarion would select one person from the legionaries involved and share with him a cup filled with poison, a particularly nasty mix of poisons as well, to the point where even Astartes' biology is pushed to the absolute limits in neutralizing it. The tradition was known as the Cups, and it consisted of 3 participants, 2 permanent members, that being the Primarch, Mortarion, and his first captain, Typhus. And the third and final member was whoever was being honoured at the time. After the battle on the Bottle World, that was Nathaniel Garro. The 3 would drain their cups of poison and issue the toast to death. This was meant both to honour the dead that they had suffered during the campaign, and to reaffirm the fact that the Death Guard Legion was still alive. It was a great honour, and many within the Legion were not particularly happy, Grulgor being one of them. Typhus as well, in all due likelihood, because not only was this a sign that Mortarion personally valued the captain of the 7th, it also meant that Mortarion had of course taken notice of the captain of the 7th. And within a legion like the Death Guard, with all of the internal schisms and constant competition, it was also seen as a sign of the Primarch's endorsement of that person's position within the Legion, both of course his actual rank and direct position, and also his recent opinions and actions. In the case of Nathaniel Garro, it was an endorsement of the old ways, the Terran ways, which was of course not particularly well liked by the other side. However, at this point in time, it is almost entirely certain that Mortarion knew what was coming and was having his own little plans. Now, it isn't 100% guaranteed, but judging by the various conversations between Typhus and Grulgor, it seems exceedingly likely that Mortarion was currently in the process of judging his Death Guards, going down the list and figuring out who he trusted and who he did not trust, who he wished to win over to his side, and who he did not mind sacrificing. The offering of the cups to Nathaniel Garro was clearly an attempt at winning Garro over to his side. The two would also have a lengthy discussion upon various subjects such as honor, tradition, and their places within the Legion. Mortarion even went so far as to profess a certain admiration for Nathaniel Garro, and stated that there was no finer captain within the Death Guard, which is also why Nathaniel Garro had the honorary rank of Battle Captain, in addition to his usual ranks. Mortarion went a surprisingly long way in trying to recruit Garro, and hinted quite heavily at the schism that was to come, quoting from the books here. "My brother expects great things of our Legion, Captain. A battle is coming that will test all of us, from the War Master to your lowly housecarl." To which Nathaniel responds, "I will be ready." But clearly Mortarion is not entirely convinced about Garro's loyalties. He has kind of been trying to prod and poke at him, trying to figure out exactly where he stands, and clearly Mortarion does not like quite what he's seeing. I would like to point out here, though, that Mortarion is reminding me a lot of Horus here. He's being very tactful, very respectful, and very much so in accordance to Nathaniel Garro's own ideals of a Primarch. Considering what we will eventually see of Mortarion and previous interactions with him, this is a very, very different Mortarion to the way we have seen and heard him act previously when surrounded by those he trusts, like, for example, his brothers. This makes me think that Mortarion is purposefully putting on a guise to reassure Nathaniel and try and feel out his loyalties while trying to live up to his expectations. In other words, he is wooing the captain of the 7th, but clearly he is, as I mentioned, not entirely convinced. He decides to push one step further. Once again, quoting from the book, "Our men find solace in the lines of command with their superiors and inferiors, but it is important that they also have a place in which the barriers created by rank can be ignored. They must have freedom to speak and think unfettered." This was a rather clear hint that they were now talking about the warrior lodgers, and Nathaniel realized this immediately. Now, a couple interesting things. One, the Warrior Lodgers is still a quote-unquote secretive organization within the Death Guard. Nathaniel knew about it, he knew certain members of his own company were parts of it, and he definitely knew that it was recruiting. In fact, it would appear that he had also been offered membership at some point in the past, but had refused it. In fact, the wording suggests that the Warrior Lodge had tried to recruit him on several occasions, and yet he had always refused membership. Another interesting thing, this means that the Legion's Warrior Lodge was fairly out in the open. It was still a little bit hidden, but it was a poorly guarded secret, shall we say. And we also now know that Mortarion knows about it. In fact, it would seem that not only does he know, but he, at the very least partially, approves of it. He asks Nathaniel why he has never chosen to become a member of the Lodge. Nathaniel simply states that he does not wish to join it for reasons of principle, and asks if he's being ordered to join, to which Mortarion says, rather interestingly, that he can no more order the workings of the Lodge than he can the stars. That is quite revealing. This means that not only does Mortarion know of the Lodges, he in all due likelihood knows of their true purpose. It would appear as if he not only knows their purpose, but has decided to subordinate himself to it. Now, that does not necessarily mean that Mortarion would be taking orders from the Lodge, but he would also recognize that it is an organization outside of his direct control, which is rather telling. Primarchs tend to be somewhat authoritative, for obvious reasons. The fact that he is not only willing to allow an organization that is outside his control to work within his legion, but even appears to be accepting and to some degree even, dare I say it, subservient to their goals, is very, very telling indeed. Another interesting thing is, he seems to still not have given up on Nathaniel Garro. The way Garro talks about the Warrior Lodges and the way the previous conversation has been going has made it pretty clear that he's unlikely to side with the War Master, and yet Mortarion still chooses to make him his equerry for a mission to the War Master's side. The Death Guard will be joining up with the War Master's forces when they are heading to Isstvan. Now, of course, it is entirely possible that the old saying, keep your friends close and your enemies closer, is applicable in this situation, but considering what is going to be unfolding in the near future, I don't think that is the case. I think that Mortarion decided to have one more go at converting Nathaniel Garro to his side. The question then would be, why? Because Mortarion had already ventured into fairly risque territory, revealing to the captain of the 7th Company that he knows of the lodges, and at the very least somewhat approves. Approves enough to not have them instantaneously shut down anyways, and he has already ventured onto some kind of, what shall we say, shaky ground. Of course, Nathaniel has absolutely no idea of the bigger picture, so to him, Mortarion's words are merely a little bit curious. There's no alarm bells ringing here or anything, and nor should there. He simply doesn't have the information necessary. Undoubtedly, these words will help him make a fateful decision further down the line, however. And I got to ask myself, isn't this a little bit odd? The Death Lord is not exactly one known to succumb to sentiment, so he can't possibly be recruiting Nathaniel just because he likes the guy. He must be seeing some particular worth in him. Now again, he's not a battle captain for nothing, he is certainly a skilled and talented member within the Death Guard, but is that truly enough for the Death Lord to show so much of his hand? Even though he in all due likelihood knows, without a shadow of a doubt, that Nathaniel doesn't have any of the pieces of the bigger picture, it's still a bit of a risky move. On the other hand, Mortarion is nothing if not pragmatic. He may simply have decided that Garro has clearly, due to being battle captain, shown himself to be a strong and worthy part of the Death Guard. And so Mortarion might simply have made a cold, calculating decision that the risks involved in revealing a few tid pieces of the greater puzzle was a relatively minor and acceptable risk, and worth revealing to feel Garro out a little bit, and see if there was any way he could possibly be persuaded to see things Mortarion's way. And clearly Mortarion still thought that there was a chance that Nathaniel could still be made to see the light. Otherwise, he probably would not have made him his equerry, as that was an honor that was utterly unprecedented within the Death Guard. Never before had the captain of the 7th Company been allowed to accompany Mortarion personally. All in all, this conversation in particular is quite interesting, because it shows very clearly that Horus is not the only one that can be a manipulative little bastard. As previously mentioned, this sounds like a very different Mortarion to the one we have seen previously. The quote-unquote real Mortarion is far more gruff, direct, and not anywhere near this cordial, respectful, and even a little bit humble, dare I say. Though I will hasten to point out, whilst this might seem a somewhat obvious ruse to an outside observer that has read the books and know how Mortarion acts, Nathaniel Garro didn't spend a whole lot of time hanging around Mortarion. This was a very, very rare occurrence, and he almost certainly would not know much about Mortarion's private and personal behavior. Additionally, being an Astartes, he was virtually genetically engineered to think the best of his Primarch, and so Mortarion was just simply playing the part to live up to Nathaniel's expectations. The direct, honourable, and just a little bit camaraderie Supreme Commander. And now we will jump forward in time a little bit, to the point where Mortarion and his new equerry has arrived in the War Master's fleet, getting ready to head for Isstvan, along with the representative of the Emperor's children, and Angron along with his equerry. Nathaniel Garro had been trusted with the recording that had been taken from a Death Guard supply ship, the Valley of Halos, that had stumbled on the Isstvan system quite accidentally, as it suffered a dangerous Geller field fluctuation and therefore had to drop out of the warp. Entirely coincidental, I'm sure. Whereupon they were just close enough to the Isstvan system to receive the distress call that was now being played for Horus and the rest of the commanders. The recording stated that the Imperial presence had been overthrown by a bunch of religious lunatics, led by a cult known as War Singers. Judging by the decay on the broadcast, the Death Guard supply hauler estimated that it must have been flung out from the planet itself something along the lines of 2 years ago. And the rest, as they say, is history. Horus had his excuse to head to the Isstvan system and begin his own personal plan. But before the events of Isstvan, of course, we have the events on Isstvan Extremis, which I talked about previously. What I didn't mention, however, was that before a certain Emperor's Children champion decided to yell at the Warsinger, a Death Guard captain tried to beat her as well. However, he was hit by the very same shockwaves that swept so many of his brothers straight back down the small pyramid. And Nathaniel Garro, being that very captain, was particularly unfortunate, because not only was he thrown off the pyramid, a very large chunk of masonry was also thrown off the pyramid, and happened to land in the exact same spot that Garro had landed in but a second previously. It was frankly a miracle that Nathaniel even survived, and he might not have if it weren't for the fact that he was a Death Guard. He was, however, very, very severely injured, and his body entered into a state of suspended animation. He was saved by Fabius Bile, of all people, and brought back to orbit, where he received medical attention. He was almost going to die again, however, but while he was dying, he received a vision of a certain woman that had been chasing off demons with small aquillas. A vision of Euphrates Keeler, or the Saint, as she was known these days. And so Nathaniel Garro miraculously woke up from his coma, and not only that, he was pretty much back to full strength. Now, even the most optimistic estimates suggested that Nathaniel's fighting days were long over, and yet here he was, not only alive, but fully recovered. A miracle. Maybe there is something to this whole saint nonsense after all, because if Euphrates is a psyker, she is a damn powerful one. Though to be entirely honest, I do say that he was fully recovered, and he was, long-term speaking, but he did have a brand new shiny leg, so that's a thing. He did have a brand new mechanical limb, which you might consider to be not entirely recovered, but here's the thing. He was originally supposed to be crippled for life, regardless of augmetics, so the fact that he was up and walking mere hours after having woken up was unusual, to say the least. Oh, another thing. So, his housecarl, Caleb, was a member of the Secret Faith, and had scraps of the Lectitio Divinatus, which he had been reading to Garro. This could possibly present us with a quote-unquote natural explanation for why Garro had his visions, since I do believe there were mentions not in the Lectitio Divinatus itself, but in other homemade versions of the saint, but bit of a stretch. And apparently the Legion as a whole was disagreeing with Garro's own diagnostics. Garro figured he was nice and healthy and could go back down to Isstvan to lead his men in the good fight against the filthy heathens. Typhus, however, and the rest of the command structure, disagreed. Nathaniel Garro was given command, or, well, we'll get back to that in a moment, over a cruiser by the name of the Eisenstein, a old rusty piece of shit, but it floats, technically speaking, in, space, etc. I don't know where I was going with this. Anyways, it was a ship, and he was supposed to be in orbit. This was not something he was particularly fond of because he wanted to go down to the planet below, where he could play with the filthy heretics. However, his condition prevented him from doing so. But I think regardless of condition, he would not have been allowed to go down to the planet, because the order to keep him in orbit came from Mortarion himself, and Typhus said that if it was up to him, he would let Nathaniel head down to the planet. And we all know what was about to happen on the planet, don't we? And speaking of the command structure, Grulgor was in on the conversation and was mightily amused that a Terran, Nathaniel Garro, would have to stay back in orbit like a crippled old man while everyone else got to fight the heathens. At which point, Typhus informed Grulgor that he would be taking dual command with Nathaniel Garro aboard the cruiser Eisenstein, something Grulgor was not at all happy about. After Nathaniel had been dismissed, however, Typhus shared with Grulgor the true reason why he was going to be held back in orbit aboard the frigate Eisenstein. Mortarion was, interestingly enough, apparently, convinced that he had convinced Nathaniel of his position, and seemed to be utterly sure that Nathaniel would in fact follow his instructions, because what comes next seems to be orders from Typhus, not Mortarion. Grulgor was placed on the frigate to make sure that Nathaniel picked the right side, and if he didn't, Grulgor would be there to, finish him, and make sure that events unfolded like Horus would want them to. Now, the wording here is interesting, because Typhus specifically mentions Horus's designs. Now, of course, we know that Mortarion was in on the betrayal, obviously, but I'm wondering just how much he had been told. Had he been told about the virus bombing? Probably. Had he been told about the extent of the betrayal? Maybe. Had he been informed fully of all of the actions taken within his own legion? I don't know. I think he held back Nathaniel because he figured he would turn. When the chips were finally down, he thought that Nathaniel would choose Legion rather than Imperium. And it would appear that Typhus was the one who changed the disposition and made it so that Grulgor would accompany him to the Eisenstein, which turned out to be not the best of ideas, but hey, details. Now, of course, I might simply be reading too much into this, because I'm gotta say, I'm a little bit confused as to why Mortarion would seemingly be so trustive of Nathaniel Garro. He hasn't really done anything to indicate that he would be particularly, traitorous, basically. But perhaps Mortarion has seen something I have not. After all, we've only known Nathaniel for one book, and he is a fairly straight-up individual, so the assumption that he would go with his Legion over the Imperium, well, it's a bit of a 50-50, I think. Hell, we of course also knows that what really convinced him at the end was words from a honoured friend of his, so perhaps if that hadn't happened, perhaps Garro would have chosen a very different path. It is entirely possible. But what is far more interesting is the fact that Typhus is apparently going against his lord's wishes. Now, not expressly so, but at the very least in part, he seems to be doubting his liege lord and taking measures to make sure that his liege lord's leniency can't come back to bite them in the arse, which I think is another example of the fractured nature of the Death God. Perhaps even an example of a fractured nature within Mortarion himself, because I mentioned, the Mortarion that is talking to Nathaniel Garro is a very different Mortarion to the one that we have seen previously. Perhaps this is not him pretending, although I still think it is. I think he's putting on a mask, but maybe, just maybe, Mortarion himself is split between his traditional views of the Legion hailing from Barbarous and the views of Terror. Perhaps Mortarion is quite literally split between his Legion and his Empire. And I present that idea because it is an interesting idea. Personally, I don't put too much stock in it, because Mortarion has never really liked the Emperor, and we'll get to that in the video about Mortarion, but he definitely has a fairly large grudge against him. And additionally, of course, the Emperor is trying to build an Imperium for, well, everyone. The strong as well as the weak. In fact, you might even say that the goal of the Empire is to protect the weak, with legions of Space Marines, etc. And this would certainly be diametrically opposed to Mortarion's views, which have been growing ever more extreme of late, that the weak are nothing but a hindrance and should be cleared out of society for the benefit of society. Nevertheless, the notion of internal conflict is certainly an interesting one that is worth entertaining, at the very least until we get more books focused around Mortarion himself. Now, I'll wrap the video up here because 50 minutes sounds about right, and I'm thinking we've got about 50 minutes in part 2 as well, so it should be roughly even. Until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.